Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this AHDB Strategic Dairy Farm webinar, where we'll be looking at monitoring and controlling mastitis at Hillhead of Covington. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Chris Stockwell, the Dairy Knowledge Exchange Manager in Scotland, and I'm joined by our strategic dairy farmer, Willie Baillie, and vet and mastitis expert, Dr James Breen. So welcome and thank you to you both.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so the format for today's webinar, I'll have a little bit of housekeeping before we start, and then an introduction to the Strategic Dairy Farm Network, a overview of Hillhead of Covington, and then really into the to the last meeting we had in October 2019. So look at the results that we had there. And the recommendations from the mastitis control plan. We'll then look at implementing the recommendations, so what William did at Hillhead, and then monitoring the progress. We've since that meeting had 3 sort of quarterly reviews, so we'll look at those, and then any final questions at the end. Okay, so I want to start with a bit of just general housekeeping. All participants are muted, so please ask any questions in the chat function. This is the box to the right of your screen. The questions are private and seen by the webinar organisers only. The other thing to mention, if you're registered with DairyPRO, then please provide your farm name, postcode and DairyPRO number in the message box to receive the points. So Willie Baillie and Hillhead of Covington is part of our Strategic Dairy Farm programme, which aims to showcase farms that are top performers and encourage farmer-to-farmer learning through discussion and expert speakers. We encourage farmers to benchmark and use KPIs to improve their productivity, peer-to-peer learning and knowledge sharing. Talking of sharing, the host farmer benefits from having a diverse group of farmers and industry looking at specific areas of their farm and questioning how and why it's done that way. So I encourage you, please, to leave any comments and suggestions in the chat box as we go along. And that applies to questions as well. Please don't wait with your questions till the end. Just put them in the chat box as we go along. So due to the coronavirus, we're running today's meeting digitally, but in normal circumstances, we would of course been on farm today. This is the 7th meeting we've had for the Strategic Dairy Farm at Hillhead of Covington. We launched in August 2018, and so far we've had topics on feeding the high-yielding dairy cow, breeding and genetics, excellence in young stock, the understanding mastitis control one I mentioned, which was October 2019, and the last one we had was challenging business resilience, which was at the end of January this year. So over the past couple of months, we've now hosted several virtual strategic dairy farm meetings like this one. We've had 2 launch farm meetings, both of these actually on organic farms, one a spring block and one an autumn block calving. And we've also had 2 meetings on our established strategic dairy farms, where they've looked at Johne's disease and most latterly at building a team. You can listen back to any of these webinars by visiting the AHDB website, going to the dairy sector and clicking on webinars. One benefit of moving online, of course, is that everybody has the opportunity to join us today. So I'm sure we've got a lot of people on from outside of Scotland as well, which is great. Thank you and welcome. So if you haven't been to Hillhead of Covington before, I'm now going to ask William to give us a brief introduction to the farm. So William, thank you for joining us. And for those that haven't been before, can you tell us a bit about where Hillhead of Covington is and a brief history of your involvement with the farm?
Hi, well, Hillhead is in South Lanarkshire in central Scotland, just outside the town of Biggar, which is about 30 miles from Edinburgh and 35 miles from Glasgow and 74 miles from Carlisle. We are 275 metres above sea level, have an annual rainfall of just over a metre. Hillhead was purchased in 1996 and we started off milking 50 cows. We've increased over the years and we're currently milking 380 pedigree Holsteins. I farm here with my wife Jennifer and our 3 children, Abby, who is 20 and currently studying agriculture at Edinburgh University, Eva, who is 18 and has just finished school and is looking to go to study geography, and Finlay, who is 13 and is obviously still at school. And we also have 4 full-time members of staff and 3 part-time members of staff.
Okay, thank you. So we can now see an aerial view of the farm. Can you tell us a bit about the farm and its infrastructure?
Well, Hillhead is 159 hectares. This year we have 26 hectares in cereals, which is split between winter wheat and spring barley. These will all be harvested and chopped as whole crop, and the remainder of the farm is all in grassland. We also have another farm which we rent 10 miles away. It's 81 hectares and it is all grassland and used for rearing young stock. On the farm buildings we have here that you see before you, this building is the main cow shed. In here there is 280 deep sand bedded cubicles, and the shed also has a slatted floor and a slurry tank with a capacity for 2 million gallons of slurry underneath it. On this next one over, this is the milking parlour, where we have a 24/24 fast exit Bomatic milking parlour, a collecting yard, and also calving boxes. Moving up over this shed here, this also has milk cows in it. This shed here has 60 cubicles in here, which is filled with first lactation animals, and it is also deep sand beds, but is on solid floors. And this one here is a shed which has now been converted for housing dry cows. Again, these dry cows are on deep sand beds. The shed is split into 2 groups of dry cows in that shed. Then the sheds over beside that, this shed here has all got young stock in it. Then you see we've a selection of silage clamps for various cuts of silage and whole crop, and we also have clamps that we can use for pitting and siling brewers' grains when we get the opportunity, if we get a good price. And this shed down here is a feed store, as we work with mainly straights. This is used for storing these in. And there's an area here which it's not on this picture, but this area has now all got calf hutches on it, and we've got 60 calf hutches in this area, as all the young calves are reared in individual hutches.
Okay, great, thank you. So now to the cows. Can you tell us a bit about the cows in the dairy herd?
Right, this picture's inside the main cow shed. We're all year round calving. Our cows are also housed all year round. We milk 3 times a day. Our current average is 11,500 litres at 3.9 butterfat and 3.2 protein. All our replacements are home reared, and we've got an average calving age of 24.5 months.
Okay, thank you. So we can see here fresh grass in front of the cows. Can you tell us a bit about your feeding management and the cut and carry that we can see in front of the cows now?
Right, the cows are all fed TMR, and we just work with one single TMR across the whole herd, and there is no parlour feeding, so everything is flat rate fed. The TMR is based on grass silage, which we also have some whole crop in and some brewers' grains, and we use straights. The straights that we use are caustic wheat, ground maize, rape meal and soya. And we mix all these straights and make it up and soak it in water the night before feeding to reduce sorting. Also in the summer, as you see, as the cows get fresh grass, but they also get fed a TMR in the morning, and then around mid-morning we give them a feed of fresh grass on top of this, and this is mowed with our own tractor with the front mower on, and our own forage wagon picks it up all in the one operation, and we also use this equipment for making our own grass silage.
Great, thank you for that introduction to Hillhead, William. So without further ado, I would now like to introduce Dr. James Breen, who is going to talk about the mastitis meeting that we had back in October and the resulting mastitis control plan that was developed. So James Breen is an Associate Professor of Cattle Health and Production at the School of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Nottingham. He is a Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons recognised specialist in cattle health and production, with particular expertise in mastitis control, and was part of the team behind the development of the AHDB mastitis control plan. He spent many years as an associate with QMMS and now works with the Evidence Group, as well as remaining in part-time dairy practice in Somerset. So James, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And hopefully everyone can see the first slide there. Thank you very much to Chris and William for that and the introduction. Really, it falls to me to go through some of the data at Hillhead. So I was very kindly invited up to meet William, brought him some Welsh cakes, and we sat down and had a look at the clinical mastitis data and the cell count data. So the first bit will be some of the results of this analysis. So we described the mastitis pattern as it was in the autumn of 2019. We then used the mastitis control plan to go into some more detail, particularly in certain areas when I visited back in October. Seems like a lifetime ago now. We then discussed some recommendations together, and we tried to stay in touch then through winter 2019-2020, see how that was going, and finally began to use the framework of the new AHDB Dairy QuarterPRO scheme to make sure we stayed in touch, kept a handle on the data, and this was December, March, and then most latterly last month as we brought things together, roughly about 9 months since we first started. So I guess by way of introduction, a lot of people say mastitis control is simple, and to some extent that is correct, in that we know from research a lot of infected cows will cure that infection during the dry period. So therefore, our emphasis is always on preventing new infections, whether they be occurring during the dry period itself or during the lactating cow period. But we need to understand when those new infections happen and focus our prevention strategies on stopping those new infections. I guess a major change in mastitis control was we used to talk a lot about a one-size-fits-all approach, where we would take relatively generic approaches to mastitis control, talk about parlour routines, talk about bedding management, talk in broad terms to all herds and try and get some blanket control measures that all these herds implemented. We've really moved away from that approach now, and we urge people to take much more of a herd-specific approach based on analysis of the herd's data to find out which control measures would actually be appropriate for a particular herd at a particular time. And clearly this is the approach we took with William and have taken with many herds over the years since the advent of the mastitis control plan and that original research from Professor Andrew Bradley and Professor Martin Green back in 2004-05. So we need to understand where new infections are coming from. And for a lot of people, we still seem to focus on the risk of new infections arising from other infected cows. And whilst this may still be the case for some herds, infection passing from an infected cow to an uninfected herd mate, what people term contagious mastitis, if you like, while this may still apply for some herds, for the vast majority of herds, control of contagious mastitis is actually very strong. And we need to perhaps move away from this. We tend to get quite focused on treating high cell count cows, culling recurrent cows, very much sometimes quite a reactive approach. And we need to move away from this and understand that for the vast majority of herds that we work with, new infections actually occur mostly from the environment. Not all herds, I stress, but for the vast majority of herds, around 90% of the herds where we look at patterns in the data, it's environmental mastitis that we end up dealing with. And of course, this is harder. It's a bit underestimated sometimes, and it's harder because it may relate to space, stocking density, ventilation, bedding management, paddock management, water quality. There's a lot of things that go on through the year in different groups and can be quite a challenge. So I guess when we talk about your herds, and the strategy that we take with your herds, what we don't want to focus on are those cows that are already infected, because we know these cows will cure during the dry period. So I didn't particularly want to talk to William about the current population of high cell count cows or cows with recurrent clinical cases. What I wanted to focus on was where the new high cell count cows and the new clinical cases were coming from, so we could slow that rate down and avoid the need to treat. So this is all about understanding the mastitis pattern, and first of all, actually categorizing Hillhead. Was it mainly dry period origin infection, or was it mainly lactation origin infection? Because clearly the control measures would be very different. If I just assumed it was the milking cows and actually it was the dry cows, well, then we're down the wrong track straight away. People say, well, what about starting with some bacteriology? And this sort of approach where, it's very tempting to take a few samples, I mean, in this case, just 2 actually, and say, well, I've had a bit of a flare-up of mastitis in the herd, and, I need some culture and sensitivity, I need to think about treatment strategies, and really, we try and move away from this. Bacteriology is important, but by itself, particularly as a starting point, it can be quite difficult. And I illustrate that with bacteriology results from Hillhead before we start looking at William's data in detail. Well, these were bacteriology results from the QMMS laboratory last summer, and these were clinical cases, and I would stress that sampling clinical mastitis cases is always more rewarding. We've got a few issues with some contaminated samples there, and we talked about sample collection with William and the team a little bit, but if you summarize it, we've got several isolates of Staphylococcus aureus, a couple of isolates of Streptococcus dysgalactia. So these are classically sort of thought about in that cow-to-cow transmission type model. We've got a couple of Enterococci. These are effectively environmental streps. And then we've also got several isolates of E. coli, several Acinetobacter. These are other sort of very environmental type things, a couple of isolates of Pseudomonas. These are classically waterborne type environmental infections. In other words, we've got a real mixed bag here, and it's very tempting to say, right, we've cultured a few Staph aureus. Don't tell me anymore. I'm straight away going to focus on cow-to-cow spread. But that would be at the expense of ignoring the environmental pathogens. So really, I mean, where do we go from here? At what point do we say, well, the bacteriology is informing us, quite a lot of things are going on, but I need some more information. What's the predominant pattern? And that's what we're all interested in. We'll find Staph aureus, for example, if we look hard enough in most herds. But does it predominate? What's the predominant pattern? And this was the approach we took at Hillhead.
Thank you, James. Just a quick question. You said that the most common pattern at the moment is environmental. It probably would have used to have been contagious. Why do you think we've seen such a change from contagious to environmental?
Over a long period of time, with very good implementation of the original 5-point plan. If we think about it over the years, antibiotic dry cow therapy, culling of infected cows, prompt treatment of clinical cases, a real focus on post-milking teat disinfection, regular maintenance of the milking machine. And over the years, implementation virtually in all herds in the UK have moved us to a point where control of the classic contagious mastitis pattern has become better and better and better and better. And actually now we're at a point for most herds where they control cell count quite well, control transmission of contagious pathogens very well, and therefore it's much more about environmental opportunists. It's interesting to reflect on, perhaps in some herds we might be going back the other way again. Herds are removing antibiotic dry cow therapy from a lot of cows quite quickly, often perhaps not with much thinking about thresholds and things like that. We maybe stop treating clinical mastitis cases, and we may see some emergence of contagious patterns in some herds in some situations, but for most herds they're under very, very good control.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. So really then to plunge on, as it were, if we just take a moment to look at the analysis of the data at Hillhead and think about the pattern. This was sort of autumn of 2019, and I was really keen to get some basic figures from William. He's got excellent data using an on-farm database, regular milk recordings with individual cow somatic cell counts. So it's very quick to get some of the key information out that we need. The cell count was averaging a little over 200,000 in the last year, but really important to point out that the new infection rate in cows calving into the herd was under good control, and I'll illustrate this in a moment. A real downward trend in the risk, if you like, of cows calving in with a high cell count. So that was clearly going very well. And the clinical mastitis rate, well, that averaged just over 40 cases per 100 cows per year for the last year. That was from uniform agri data. But again, keen to point out, if you looked at the rate of new cases in cows that were less than a month calved, well, that was under very good control, actually. So always buried within some headlines, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's aspects of mastitis control that aren't going well. So that was sort of our starting point, if you like. Just to illustrate it, I don't want to sort of bore people to tears as such, but if we focus on the cell count for a moment and look at the classic sort of how many high cell count cows do I have and how many chronically high cell count cows do I have? Well, if you focus on early lactation and remove the impact of some stale cows, if you like, the prevalence was under pretty good control. We tended to be less than 20% of cows, that's that green line with a high cell count, and we tended to be around 10% of cows that were chronically high cell count, that's the blue line. But you can also see a bit of seasonal variation, actually, that the proportion of high cell count cows and chronic cows tended to rise a little bit through the winter and then fall away. And we were on a sort of falling away pattern when I sat down with William and looked at the data in the autumn. So the prevalence is relatively low in early lactation. And I mentioned already that the control of new infections in freshly calved cows was going very well. And this chart here just shows this red line is slowly coming down over the last 18 recordings. What we're measuring here is the percentage of cows which are being dried off low cell count, but calving back into the herd with a high cell count. We hope that doesn't happen too often. And you can see it was around 25% of cows calving in with a high cell count. When we get to the autumn of 2019 on the right-hand side here, and we're now about 10% of cows calving in with a high cell count. So really good progress in this area, actually, and reflects some of the comments that William's made about the dry cow management and the sand. So what we did see, actually, was when we tended to see new high cell count cows, they tended to turn up in early lactation, and they tended to turn up in the winter months. This green line is smoothing out the percentage of cows going from low to high, if you like, between each recording. And that tends to rise through the winter, but was falling away when I sat down with William. And of course, the new high cell count thing is important because we couldn't disguise this by treating cows or culling cows. This is the first time they go high cell count. So if we see a bit of seasonality, this talks to us about environmental infection pattern and perhaps something about milking cow environment, particularly in the winter. And finally, I dug around in the clinical mastitis cases, so I wanted to move away from cell count for a moment and look at new clinical mastitis cases. So these are cows that have not been reported, detected with clinical mastitis, clots in the milk, since calving. They are, and if we focus on the second lactation and above group, so not the first lactation heifer group, this is a real spike. This green line shows a real spike and a surge in the rate of new clinical cases in cows that are more than 30 days calved. So definitely something about lactating cow environment and a real winter thing last year. And if you notice, the rate of new cases then dropped sharply away into the summer. So I guess to sort of draw that together for a bit before we pause again, our main priorities: new infections during lactation, really good performance during the dry period actually from William. And not every herd is like this, and I urge you to first of all think about whether the dry period is important or not. In this herd it wasn't. The predominant new infection pattern was in lactation. And also the importance of environmental pathogens. We saw it in the bacteriology, but we can really see it in the pattern. We've got things like seasonality. We've got things like a slow build of chronic high cell count cows in early lactation. So there might be a bit of Staph aureus knocking about, but it doesn't appear to really influence the pattern to a great deal. So I certainly ended this first bit thinking about, right, what am I going to do to control environmental infection during lactation, and possibly particularly things about the winter maybe. Any comments at that stage, Chris, or shall I carry on?
No, carry on, please. Thank you.
Thank you. So we come to the next bit now, and really a sort of a process where I can start asking William lots of questions and getting in the way and wandering around, and thinking about a structured approach. Well, we can turn to the mastitis control plan for this. And the mastitis control plan offers a bit of structure and a great deal of detail in when we start itemizing certain things. And it uses software. So I used the electronic plan software that's still going and still available for people if they want to become plan deliverers. I urge you to go down this route. And it doesn't tell me what to do as such, but it's very much a guidance. So I could ask questions about current management. For example, we can see here in the environmental section for lactating cow management, I'm clearly going to want to ask William, how many times per week do we apply clean inorganic bedding material to the cubicles? And William's response there was twice a week. And I'm going to put a little red flag by that, because the plan would want at least 3 times a week, for example, for clean sand into the cubicles. If William was using organic bedding material like sawdust or straw, well, at a basic level, we would want daily, because we know these sorts of bedding materials will deteriorate a lot quicker in terms of pathogen load at the teat end. So we went through the mastitis control plan, focusing on certain areas. I perhaps wasn't as interested in the dry cow management. I was much more interested in the lactating cow management. And what I wanted to do was get to a stage like this. So here's a short list of recommendations out of the mastitis control plan software that you can see here on the left-hand side, and distill it down into those big wins. This was all about Andrew and Martin's original research, where they showed very clearly that we try to get to a small group of recommendations that we think are likely to have the biggest impact on farm. These are not necessarily things that William's going to agree to do, I hasten to add, but things that I'm going to advise him are probably going to give us the biggest bang for our buck, as it were. And essentially, they drilled down into 5 specific areas. There were things about the sand, storage, frequency of application, particularly into the high-yielding group beds, into the cows that are likely to be most susceptible to a new infection. There were things about the scraping. So William noted that the heifer group on the solid floors are scraped 3 times a day, but the main lactating cow groups on the slats were only scraped once, and the collecting yard was only scraped once as well. So I was keen to ask if it was possible to increase the scraping frequency. Things about the space, the high yielding cow group, when you started calculating available outside space, that we're a bit short in that area. And when we talk about environmental infection, opportunistic infection, the more space we can give the cows, particularly at this level of production, this is a very high yielding herd, the better able we are to dilute out the infection pressure. Things about the water, and the culturing Pseudomonas, as the QMS laboratory picked up for us. Actually, I don't want to ignore this, because we know that the water can be a source of opportunistic infection. We've got header tanks that supply the volume washer in the parlour. We need to think about this a little bit. And finally, I need to think about the single-use cloths. So William's got a very good routine in the parlour, but it does rely on single-use cloths to clean off the pre-milking teat disinfectant. And there was some conversations we got into about temperature of the wash, quality control, what state were these cloths in, even though they might look all right, and something we could firm up this area a little bit. So those were the things that we talked about initially, and that I'll go on to talk about in a bit more detail with William over the next few slides.
Thank you, James. We've got a couple of questions come in. The first is regarding dry cows on sand bedding. Is there less mastitis seen in dry cows due to sand bedding? And would you recommend sand for dry cows?
I would recommend deep sand for dry cows for a number of reasons, and I think we mustn't underestimate the cow comfort with sand as well, with nice deep beds. It certainly needs looking after, but as a way to control the risk of new infection, particularly shortly after drying off, and very particularly in the late dry period where cows are very susceptible to new infection, deep sand, particularly cubicles, does offer a very good way of trying to reduce the risk of new infection shortly before calving, yes. But they do need to be looked after. We do need to manage them, to the same standard that we would manage the milking cow beds.
Yeah, thank you. On water testing, is water testing only required for borehole supplies?
No, not necessarily, and I think even those herds that are on mains supply, once there's header tanks involved, and there's a certain storage of water going on, particularly, there's various things, and Andrew will tell you this, when herds are perhaps recapturing the plate cooler water, recycling that plate cooler water, putting it back into the header tank, we can get buildup of infection, even if it's not borehole or spring water to start with, particularly when it's borehole and spring water to start with, though I think it does become very important. And certainly the mastitis control plan would recommend twice annual testing of water, and sometimes, things around what's it like when it comes out of the header tank, and cleaning out the header tanks, for example, on a regular basis. Some herds do appear to get into trouble with this. It may manifest as back to scan issues. It may manifest as things around recurrent clinical cases, and things like that. And you go digging around and you can find things like Pseudomonas causing mastitis in cows, and that leads us back to thinking about water.
Okay, thank you. A question from earlier actually was, why would there be more mastitis cases in the winter?
Yeah, very good question. Because actually in 365-day housed herds, you almost expect it the other way around. With sort of temperature, humidity index, better pathogen survival in the summer months. And the answer is, I'm not sure why it was here that we saw an increase over the winter months. And William may be able to shed a bit more light on this as we go, whether this was something about the sand quality through the winter, something about changing to the udder cloths, something that happened specifically over that winter. I'm not sure, but certainly it was quite stark in the data analysis. That actually for William, the rate of new cases was coming down through the summer, but had been very high through the previous winter.
One last question before we move on, if that's okay. And this time it's for William. William, in terms of the sand, how do you get the sand out of the slats?
The tank that underneath the slats has got 2 access ramps in it that we can actually, so we can drive right underneath the shed with the forklift. So we pump all the liquid slurry out through the summer when we're spreading it in silage ground, and then in the autumn we just go in and dig it out.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, there are more questions coming in, but we'll save those, and on the interest of time, if we could just move on, please, James. Thank you.
Yes, of course. The next section now, we're just going to talk a little bit about implementing some of these recommendations, and focusing on these 5 areas that we talked about. So I'm just going to introduce a couple of bits and pieces before we pass over to William for his comments. One of these is, I briefly sat down with William and Jennifer at the end of the day, just to think about the cost of a new clinical mastitis case, because clearly with everything in this, we've got to put it back to some cost benefit, haven't we? And I think it's often important, rather than just plucking a number out of the air, that we just sit down and work through it. So this uses the cost benefit calculator tool that comes with being a plan deliverer, and working through milk price, feed, fertilizer cost, that sort of thing, specific figures for William and Jennifer. You could say, well, in round figures, about £350 for the cost of a mild or moderate clinical case of mastitis. And that's made up of quite small direct costs, the cost of some tubes, the cost of throwing the milk away, and much larger indirect costs, the risk of the cow exiting the herd, the decrease in future milk yield, those sorts of things. So as sort of in the back of our minds, we're thinking, if I'm being irritating and asking William to make some changes, how many new cases do we need to save to justify a second scrape or another sand bedding up, in the earlies and the highs groups? How many new cases do we need to save to make this work? So I guess, how did William and the team get on? What did they implement from our shortlist? Well, the first thing I wanted them to do was to use more sand more often. And actually we'll focus here on the early lactation group, the highs group, if you like, increase frequency of the sand bedding to 3 times per week. William, how did you get on with this? And in terms of the time, in terms of more sand, what are your comments in this area, please?
Well, this is one of the things that we did implement. We moved on to bedding. We now bed up 3 times a week, so we do them every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and we actually bed all the milk cows get bedded 3 times a day, 3 times a week now. And we actually found that it is quite beneficial on the management side as well, because you're bedding more often, it takes less time.
Right.
So you're then not holding the cows back from returning back to the shed.
Yes.
Whereas when you're doing it 3 times a day, twice a week, it takes longer to bed them. So there was more of a backlog at the parlour on the days you were bedding. But actually on 3 times a week, that's because the job is done faster. That side of it's working better as well.
Good. Can you put a figure on the total amount of time? So you're saying essentially then it hasn't really taken longer to do this, because you've got 3 shorter sessions rather than 2 longer ones. But is there any? Sorry, mate. Go on, sorry.
We're basically spending the same amount of time bedding up and using the same volume of sand, but we're doing it on 3 days. It's spread over 3 days rather than doing it on 2.
Right. So essentially it's cost neutral in a way then, is it? You haven't spent more money on more sand necessarily?
No, I would say there's been no real additional cost with bedding more often.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you very much. So that one's a yes to that one. We then talked more in terms of scraping. So I appreciate on the slats it's once a day, and I was asking for twice. And the collecting yard was once a day, wasn't it? And I was asking for twice. How did you get on with this?
That's something we didn't actually implement. So we still, the collecting area is also slatted. So
Yes.
the collecting area, all the slats are still scraped once a day, and the solid floor scraped 3 times, but that's the same as it was before.
Right, thank you. So that's important for us to bear in mind then when we look at the data, isn't it? That's one of the recommendations which wasn't implemented. Okay, thank you. I'll have to get you some more Welsh cakes, so you can't say no to me when your mouth's full. No, I'm joking. So the third one was the water quality and its use. So we talked a lot about monitoring the borehole water quality, didn't we? And particularly around perhaps using less of the volume washer during the milking procedure. How did you get on here?
Yeah, this was an area we put quite a bit of focus on. We like to try and keep the parlour clean when we're milking, and I think some of the staff were maybe a bit hose happy, and that they were constantly hosing down. So we really reinforced them now that we prefer not to wash when the cows are in, but if they need to wash up when the cows are in the parlour, to do it before they start any teat preparation. Once they start prepping the cows and cleaning the teats, we've really enforced that the volume washer doesn't get used until after that side then exits the parlour.
Right, good. So happy there's less water being thrown around and less sort of misting of pathogens particularly. But the borehole water testing was quite good, if I remember rightly, wasn't it? In terms of the water will never be sterile as such, but in terms of pathogen load, it's quite low risk, I think now, isn't it?
Yes, that was an area that we were concerned that might be causing an issue because it's borehole water, and it is also recycled through the plate cooler, so it's stored, right? With a bit of lukewarm heat in it. But when the last sample was taken and got it analysed, the water actually had a pretty low pathogen load on it. So
good.
I think
good.
Yeah.
And we'll definitely keep an eye on that. Once or twice a year.
Yep.
So that's a yes. Then we're using less water during the parlour routine. We're monitoring the quality of the borehole water. So the fourth item was around the udder cloths, wasn't it? And I know this sparked quite a lot of debate. And I think one of the things I was a bit concerned about was the set of udder cloths you were using were quite old. So we had a set kindly donated by David Jackson, didn't we, to get you started with a completely new set. Where write down the date we opened the pack. We thought about the wash cycle itself. We wanted that to be 90 degrees at the start, and we wanted to get into a little bit of quality control, sending a couple of cloths down to the lab, seeing what the coliform counts and the total bacterial counts were like. How did you get on in this area? When did you start a brand new set of cloths, and how did you get on with the cleaning?
Well, we started the new set of cloths just not long after the meeting in October, as because David Jackson donated us those cloths, and the cloths probably we had kind of got into a routine of when a cloth got the milkers, when one cloth looked a bit shabby, they would fling it out and every now and again take a pack of new ones out and add them in. So the cloths weren't actually being changed as a whole, but at that point we changed them all and started with the new cloths. And I would also say that the new cloths are of a much better quality.
Right.
And so we've been using them, washing at 90 degrees and regularly testing the bacterial load in them.
Good. So the machine can cope with 90 degrees.
Yes.
And then as it comes out of the washing machine, do you add disinfectant during the wash, or how do you store the cloths afterwards?
The cloths are stored just as they come out. The machine, they're then stored in a tub with a lid on it, and we actually disinfect them with the water and peracetic acid before we then use them, so that they're slightly damp when we use them, but it's disinfected with peracetic acid.
I see. So they're coming out of the washing machine spun dry. They're in a clean container with a lid, and then just prior to use, they're soaked in some peracetic acid.
Yes.
Yeah, good. Have you got one set per milking now? So you've got the AM set, the lunchtime set, the night set. So they're just doing one milking per day, or is it one set for every milking?
It's just one set that we use every time. We just wash them. They're getting washed 3 times a day. So it's the same set of cloths we use continuously.
And have you changed that set since you started this new set back at the beginning of November from David? Yeah, are they now, what would that be, 7 months old? Are they that old now?
Yes, they're that old. We're still using them yet, and as I say, I've been very pleased with those cloths. They don't seem to be deteriorating at all. And the last cloth we had away for sample, the results come back pretty good. So
good. Thank you. Well, and you note the quality control there, so we can bring this slide in, can't we? If we've upped the wash temperature, we changed the batch of cloths. We're now sort of monitoring this. In terms of the monitoring, then, you know, the top slide there is an example of perhaps one of the older cloths, and how when we talk about measuring total bacterial count and coliform count, how contaminated these cloths can get. And you can see there over on the right hand side we've got some direct plating results, and we're picking up Pseudomonads and Acinetobacter. The bottom one there, I believe, was your latest cloth, wasn't it, that you sent away to the QMMS lab? So that was a cloth with a TBC of about 67, coliform count very low. So in terms of risk, low risk in terms of you know, transmission of pathogens and opportunistic infection. I can't remember when that one was taken, William. Was that back in April or May time, that cloth sample?
Yeah, that last one was done in May, so that was the cloth after about 6 months.
Okay, so that's interesting. Even after 6 months old, they seem to be staying pretty clean, don't they? So perhaps we'll aim to get one down to the lab this summer and you know, see what it's like after 9 months. Because at some point they're probably going to deteriorate to an extent, well, we'll need another set.
Yes.
Okay, good, thank you. So that was done. And the last thing then, and I know this is always a bit of a tricky one here, but and this has been taken on by Jake Thompson and the research team at University of Nottingham, actually, and they've been looking at what they've now termed living space. So space that isn't feeding, that isn't lying area, you know, whether it's wide passageways or whether it's outside space, loafing area, we've classically called it, haven't we? But I just sort of mooching around the shed with you, keen to explore some additional space, particularly for the early lactation, you know, the high yielding group. We had a little look, you've got that bit of area at the end of the shed, haven't you, outside? How did you get on with thinking about giving the cows a bit of access to some more space?
We gave it a bit of thought, but we didn't actually do anything about it. The area outside that we had discussed, that we could let them out the end of the shed. There were a couple of things that why we didn't implement it. One was we need to drive through that area to get in to feed the cows. Yes. So it would have meant driving across the dirty concrete before then driving down the feed passage. So that concerned me a little. And also up that end of the shed, we're just going into the winter. It is very exposed up there, and it can be pretty rough out there in the winter on a windy, wet day. And I didn't know if it would just be the overly appealing for the cows going out in it over the winter months. So we decided over the winter not to progress with that.
Yeah. No, I take your point entirely, and you know, like you say, there was some extra things we'd need to think about, whether it was regrooving, whether it was the winter, and whether or not the cows would actually choose to disperse into that area. I mean, the thing is, I suppose we need to look at the data next, don't we, and see whether this is something we park, you know, for another day, as it were. But so the scraping and the outside space weren't implemented, but things around the sand, things around the water, and things around the cloths were. So that gives everyone an idea about exactly what was done, perhaps. Any comments at this stage, Chris, before we sort of bring it back together with what's happened?
Yeah, conscious of time, so I will just ask two questions if you don't mind at this point. The first is going back to the sand again, and can raking sand beds actually spread mastitis?
No, I mean, in short, you know, very unlikely. I mean, when we talk about spreading mastitis, it depends, I guess, what we mean. Do we mean raking up contaminated sand from underneath onto the top, or do we mean transmitting you know, I don't know, pathogens from one bed to another. It's very unlikely. I know people do still like to rake the sand. Whether you do or you don't, I don't think it's that important personally. I think it's more about putting clean sand in more frequently. I think there's things around how people store their sand. You know, is it under a tarp? You know, is it getting, you know, sort of sprayed with slurry because people drive past the heap? I think probably more interesting to reflect on is for those herds that use deep sand, do they, you know, maybe once a year dig the whole lot out and start again? You know, and I know some herds do that, but I wouldn't be concerned about spreading infection in inverted commas by raking sand. No.
Okay, great. We then got a question on the cloths. Are the cloths tested, or were the cloths tested after being dipped in the peracetic acid?
No, William, please jump in if I'm wrong, but what we wanted to do was get cloths as they were spun dry and out of the machine. So these were cloths that were...
Yeah,
Sorry,
those samples that were there were cloths that were just spun dry out the machine. We initially did sample one after it was soaked in the peracetic originally, but those other cloths were just straight out the machine.
That's it. I mean, that's what we're trying to understand, is the effectiveness of the wash process, as it were. You know, and still, you know, a lot of people tend to wash at 60 degrees, and that's unlikely to be adequate in terms, and particularly things like the coliform count. Washing at 90 degrees, you'll sleep better at night.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so if we can move on to the final section. Thanks, James.
Yeah. So just keen to put up some of the data again and to the sort of things that William and I have been doing. So we wanted to sort of smoothly get into some sort of structure with monitoring the data, and I've turned now to the QuarterPRO scheme. So those of you on the call may have heard of this now. This was launched at Dairy Tech back in February, but as a method of making sure we keep an eye on mastitis and udder health in the herd. Step one, we're always going to keep an eye on the pattern. Are we still the same infection pattern? Step two, we're going to react with some resource material, make sure we're in the right area. And step three, we're going to keep going. You know, we're going to optimize ongoing control. So that's the QuarterPRO process. So step one then is the pattern, isn't it? So having started with the environmental lactation infection pattern with William, a few months later, I want to make sure that that's still the predominant pattern. You know, it suddenly hasn't changed, and we're still talking about sand and water, and it's now not the important thing. So again, we need to get into this routine, if you like, of making sure we can access the milk recording data, whether it's some CIS, NMR, or QMMS. All three organizations will provide what's called a CDL file, a common data layer. For those of you on the call that are doing this sort of work, vets and advisors, farmers yourselves, please have a go. There's free software you can download from the QuarterPRO webpage. There's a little YouTube video there if you can stand the excitement to get through, but that will convert the data for you. This CDL converter was provided by QMMS and Summit. They've written it, free to download. It'll convert the data and calculate the indices we need. If, like William, you keep your clinical mastitis cases in an on-farm database, well, I can go to, in William's case, Uniform Agri, extract all the clinical cases and merge that in. So we've got all the clinical mastitis data on top of the cell counts. And then we're going to output all the data we need for the last 3 months, and the 3 months before that, and the 3 months before that. So we're working backwards in time. And actually, you know, when we're doing this, we can go back as far as 18 months worth of data to make sure we pick up seasonal changes and the importance of what's happening across the dry period. So that's the structure that I wanted to get into with William, that every 3 months, William would send me his milk recording and his mastitis data. I would convert it using the converter tool, and then I would put that information into the Mastitis Pattern Tool. So this is the other bit of software available from the QuarterPRO webpage. The pattern analysis tool written by QMMS and Nottingham, another little YouTube video there to show you how it works. But essentially, I can import the data I've just made. I can populate the pattern tool very, very quickly, And here we are with, I've got 3 months ending the 15th of December, for example, and I was looking at the data with William, and we can check that the pattern is still the one we were talking about in the summer. In other words, we're going to get a numerical score based on all the cell count data and the clinical mastitis data. Are we predominantly contagious? Are we predominantly environmental infection during the dry period? Are we predominantly environmental infection in lactation? This example here, we're still very clearly an environmental lactation pattern. So I know we're still in the right area when we're talking about sand and water and cloths and the like. So that's what the habit we were trying to get into. And then step 2 is we can refer back to some resource material to help us when we're discussing things with William and the team. So I clearly want to go to the environmental lactation resource material, and I can flick through this. This takes out little bits and pieces from the mastitis control plan to help people when they're having these conversations. So I can refer back to that if I wish. And then step 3, I'm going to do this again in 3 months' time. And really important we do this with our dairy farm clients, that we make sure we get hold of their data, we make sure we get hold of the last 3 months worth of clinical cases, we make sure we go through the pattern tool again, make sure we've got the right resource material, and review the data every 3 months to make sure we're in the right area when we're talking about mastitis control. There's no point me assuming infection is going between cows in the parlour just because I've got a couple of Staph aureus isolates if the pattern is overwhelmingly still environmental infection in lactation. No point talking about cubicle bed management with William if actually most of his mastitis cases were happening from the dry period. I know they're not, but this is the thing, I've got to make sure I'm in the right area. And it's the importance of predicting this pattern always. And the QuarterPRO process now and the CDL data converter and the mastitis pattern analysis tool that QMS and Nottingham have made available through AHDB now means that farm advisors, vets, farmers themselves can do this and make sure that they know their underlying pattern. So returning to William's situation then, William regularly emailed me with his milk recording and mastitis data out of Uniform Agri. I could convert this data and run the pattern tool. I could refer to the resource material and we could keep the discussion ongoing. So what happened when we're basing our information on this? What's happened? What's the situation now as we come to June 2020 when we sat down the other week as a group and talked about this? Well, I can tell you that the cell count now at Hillhead has averaged 170,000 in the last year. New infections in cows calving into the herd are still around 10–11%, but the new infections in lactation is now less than 5%. And remember, that was the area that certainly increased through winter 2018-2019, and was one of the things we focused on, was these cows going high cell count for the first time in lactation. Well, that's now averaging less than 5%. And the clinical mastitis rate itself is now averaging 28 cases per 100 cows per year for the last 12 months, data out of Uniform Agri. Remember, it was 42. The rate of new cases in cows in the first 30 days staying below a target of 1 in 12. The rate of new cases in cows more than 30 days calved is staying below a target of 2 in 12, and I'll illustrate this shortly. And if we look at the rolling 3-month average clinical mastitis rate, William submitted his data to the end of June. Well, we're now 19 cases per 100 cows per year for the last 3 months. Really good. And I know William and the team, they're looking for it. They do detect and report mild clinical cases, just clots in the milk. So we know this isn't an underreporting issue. 19 cases per 100 cows per year is very good control, particularly at this level of production as well. So just to illustrate this now, this is the cell count data. Remember, I showed you the green and blue lines. These are the proportion of cows above 200,000, the green line, and the proportion of cows remaining above 200,000, if you like, what we call chronics, the blue line. Far fewer high cell count cows and fewer chronically high cell count cows in early lactation. And we're staying, at a very low prevalence here now. So much better control of infection as measured by cell count. And this was brought about by excellent control of new high cell count cows in early lactation. So this green line that you can see in these yellow bars, this is the percentage of cows going from below 200,000 to above 200,000 every time we do a milk recording. And I'm focusing in early lactation. So I've got rid of cows in late lactation, if you like. So we can see we've come down from sort of 9 or 10% over on the left-hand side to 5% over on the right-hand side. Really good control now of new infection in lactation. And also, if I really wanted to look at new clinical cases, and these are occurring in cows more than 30 days in milk, we haven't had a repeat of the previous winter. So the rate of new clinical cases stayed low and has remained low, that green line. And actually in May, in the month of May 2020, William reported no new clinical cases in cows that are more than 30 days calved. There were other clinical cases, you know, 1 or 2 in some fresh calvers and a bit of recurrence, but there were no new cases in cows more than 30 days in milk. This is excellent control. And I know they're looking for it. I know they're not ignoring it, that they are reporting, detecting and reporting, you know, mild cases. And then we can come to the 12 months ending May 2020. Just over 100 clinical mastitis events reported in the 12 months ending May 2020. And we can see the yellow in those bars here. Yellow refers to cases that are more than 30 days in milk, and the proportion of those has slowly shrunk. We've got continued excellent control of new clinical cases in the first 30 days. So we're doing relatively much better now. And if I run the pattern again, so just to get into our habit with the QuarterPRO process, I ran the data for the 3 months ending the end of June 2020. And we can see actually that the numerical score, if you like, that the pattern tool gives us, the weighting it gives us, shows that the contribution from environmental infection in lactation has shrunk quite a lot now, and actually is virtually similar to the infection pressure out of the dry period, if you like. Note the excellent control of contagious infection patterns. So even though we knew there was a bit of Staph aureus knocking about, it really doesn't amount to anything in terms of a pattern of disease in the herd. So really to bring it to a close, if you like, just a couple of slides now, the mastitis pattern has changed a little bit. You know, real focus on controlling environmental infection in lactation has meant now the pattern has changed a little bit. And Catherine Leach and the team at QMS have presented this at British Mastitis Conference. We do see this in herds. You control one area very well, well then, relatively speaking, other areas might now come to the fore. Because we're controlling environmental infection in lactation so well, and that's shrunk a lot, we've got a little bit perhaps of evidence that the next thing we might think about is just going over a little bit of dry cow management. And so we also discussed the antibiotic use, and I'm keen to do this again with William a bit because we benchmarked antibiotic use for the period 2018-19, and we've got some benchmarks there about milligram use, daily doses and courses. I'd quite like to look at that again because I would expect that to be lower now for the last 12 months. So in summary, when we started all this, we had a very clear mastitis pattern, environmental infections predominating and predominantly happening in lactation, not the dry period. And that was back in the autumn of 2019. We had a small set of measures. We wanted to target at early lactation, both in terms of environment management and teat preparation, so things like the sand and the cloths, but that was for William's herd. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean we go around doing this with every herd. And we've seen a reduction in both new high cell counts in lactation and new clinical cases in lactation. And it really highlights the importance of monitoring this data. And we've begun the QuarterPRO process, if you like, to keep this going every 3 months. What would I perhaps like to talk with William next? I'd like to look at the antibiotic use just to see where we are now. And perhaps I'd like to have a little discussion about dry cows and maybe heifers calving into the herd in terms of tightening up some elements of control there. I'd just like to take the opportunity before I hand back to Chris to say, look, thank you very much. William and Jennifer and the team at Hillhead for inviting me up last autumn. Charles at Clyde Vets for helpfully providing a lot of the information and discussions during the day, and Chris Stockwell and Karen Harrison Lowe at AHDB for sorting out the invite in the first place and getting me up there. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, James. Apologies, everybody. We're just running ever so slightly over time. So I'll just take 2 questions now, if that's okay, before we finish. Any questions that we've had that haven't been answered, we will answer them and post onto the Hillhead of Covington webpage on our Strategic Dairy Farm network pages. So the first question, James, is just if we don't use peracetic acid, can we use hypochlorite?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a bit of a tricky one, isn't it? Do you soak the cloths in something, or, you know, personally, my preference would be to spray, you know, a pre-milking teat disinfection product that is licensed. You know, either dip it or spray it onto the teats, wait 30 seconds, and then use our nice, clean, you know, spun dry cloth to wipe it off. But you know, you could pre-soak in peracetic, you could pre-soak it in things like effervescent chlorine tablets. I think with a lot of these things, it's then monitoring the impact on the data, isn't it? You know, whichever you're using. But yes, you could do.
Could I just add a comment in there? That is, with the disinfectant the cloths, we're using peracetic acid, and that was that spike that we had last winter and through into the spring that year. I can't prove it, but we're putting some of that down to, we think some of the peracetic acid wasn't very good that we were using at that point.
Right, yeah.
And one of the other things that we do now is we actually only buy it in 25-litre drums, so
Yes.
that because peracetic can degrade through time, so that it's trying to keep that fresh to make sure that if we are soaking and disinfecting, that is done properly, because I think if it's not done properly, it could lead to a lot of problems.
Yes, and you end up with a sort of a wet towel, you know, with no disinfectant, and particularly then if the towels, you know, had deteriorated to an extent where they were quite contaminated already. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so apologies if we haven't got to answer all your questions, but as I say, we will make sure we answer them and post them on to the Hillhead webpage. So I'd like to just conclude this webinar by saying a very big thank you to William and for James, and of course a big thank you to yourselves for listening. We've had about 180 attendees, so that's fantastic. Thank you. If you've enjoyed this webinar this afternoon, you can follow William's story online by going to the AHDB webpage, choosing the dairy sector, and then go to Strategic Dairy Farms. We hope you'll be able to join us again when we're back on farm. In the meantime, if you look out for any updates on the AHDB Dairy Facebook and our Twitter pages. So it just leaves me to say thank you all very much for listening, and goodbye.